Anyway, we speak another time.
Good evening, everybody. Ambassador, friends, colleagues, online and in Greece. We would like to welcome you to this first spring lecture at the Norwegian Institute. Tonight we are very, very happy to have back and near Professor Christina Amadou, who is a long-standing and fervent supporter of the Norwegian Institute. She has been one of the initiators and protagonists of the establishment of the Friends Association Atheneum in Oslo. So thank you also for that. And let me say a few words about Christina. She's a professor in History of Ideas at the University of Oslo, working at the moment on a project called Norway's Antiquity, which focuses on the transmission and the uses of the classical in 19th-century Norway. Christina has delivered a PhD on late antique hagiography and broadly published on Byzantine and late antique topics. As a historian of ideas, Christina looks at projects concerning the classical and the political ideological reception of Greek antiquity in the Scandinavian context, something which is very unique. Apart from her academic career, Christina is an active translator as well. She has translated more than 20 books from French to Norwegian, Byzantine texts, Plato's text, the Politikos, from Greek, and she has been involved in the new Norwegian translation of the Bible. So these activities in mind, Christina has been exploring the Norwegian history of translation, especially when it comes to Greek, classical Greek authors. Currently she's working on Homer, Norwegian translations on Homer, and exploring topics of identity, originality and form in history translation. So Christina, the floor is yours, but before we start, I would like to say something that is not included in her brief presentation. Christina helped a lot, and she has been a collaborator in the exhibition we did, The Travelers from the North, in 2019 at the Nordic Library, and presented a booklet together with Jurun Auckland, who wrote the first introduction. She discussed a very particular topic about the encounter between Schliemann and a Norwegian traveler, Osted, in Athens, back in the late 19th century. We have the booklet here. Do we have a copy handy? Yeah. So then you can have a look after the lecture and see more about this very exciting and quite a known incident of the traveling history. So Christina, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being with us. On behalf of Paschalis, Kostas and myself, warm welcome to me this evening.
Thank you, Delia. Thank you for inviting me. It feels like it's 20 years ago. I came here last time, but you said this is from 2019?
Yes, so the exhibition was inaugurated.
So the pandemic that makes feel that is such.
It does.
Yes, but thank you. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm happy to see that it's such an echo when I'm speaking.
It's in the speaking pad.
I'm so happy to see that the institute is in place, the library, Acropolis, the people that. I'm back in Athens, I'm very happy for that. And today I'm going to talk about what we call the domestication of the Greek heritage in Norway. And that's part of what happened in Norway, as in Greece in the 19th century, was a search, quest for a new national identity, many levels. The Norwegians went back to the historical roots, to the Vikings, to their own history, but also to antiquity. And that's quite a paradox that antiquity played such an important role for the Norwegian nation building. And that's what I'm going to Um, hmm. So this is not a project only of myself, but also as part of a research group, as Delia mentioned, called Norway's Antiquity. And our favorite picture is this one. It's not a Greek temple, it's a Chateau de Plaisance in Ullevål, just where the university is today. So it's one called Plus. They built such a Greek monument in the late 18th century, so it's a bit earlier than our period. So that's the point of departure. It's the need for building such things for adapting classical antiquity in Norway. And I'll say just a few words about this working group, because it's a research group. We are historian of ideas, like me. It's historian of history, and we are architects and historians of art and people working in the museums. So all those are gathering and studying the impact of antiquity on Norwegian nation building. So we have such columns. One of them is the educational system, where all the young boys had to learn Latin and Greek. So that was part of the education for everybody in the 19th century. The building activity, I'll come back to it, because why didn't the Norwegian make Norwegian wooden buildings, but classical looking buildings when they made the official buildings? They made it in a Prussian Greek style, just like the university and the monuments here in Athens. Same architects. The Norwegian also needed to have objects from antiquity. They didn't have much original, but they had plasters and copies to let people touch and see what antiquity was like. And the last of our fields is the translations, and that's my topic today, and my topic when I'm studying antiquity in Norway. Because it was from the middle of the 19th century, it was a huge movement translating classical text into Norwegian. And that was part of the Norwegian struggle for a new language, for a new Norwegian language. So this language should have the classics into it. And among those texts, Homer was the most important. So I will be our case today. Just a few words about this Norwegian history. It's not very different from the Greek history, in fact. So we had in 1814 liberation from Denmark, 1905 dissolution from the union with Sweden, and all the time here it was a strong movement. This quest for a Norwegian identity was followed by a quest for a Norwegian language. The Norwegians should not speak Danish, they should speak Norwegian. So they tried in different ways to create a new Norwegian language. And when they translated, it was into this language. So it was a sort of political will to show that this new Norwegian language, that it could even support big texts as Homer and as the classics. Yes?
Just a question. So are you talking about the new Norwegian language? You mean Nynorsk?
No. I can say two words about it. I was going to do that. Because the Norwegians, they had two strategies for a new language. One of them was a slightly modified Danish language that became the urban riksmål, the urban language in Norway. And the other one was a gathering of dialects and the creation of a Kunstsprache as a new Norwegian language based on dialects. So we had two languages in Norway, and in some ways two struggles for languages, but and the translations were in both of them. So we had translations of Homer into Nynorsk and translation to dialectal language, and we had translation into a modified Danish Norwegian. So we had those two. So this is very close for Greeks and for you knowing the Greek language situations, very close to the Katariosa and the Domesticating discussion in Greece. Except that, how to say, that in Norway the Danish-like urban language won over the dialectal in percentage. So small difference there, not very small. Okay. Very strong to do this. There, no. So when the Norwegians wanted to have, they should have their own constitution and their own institutions, among them the university. That, as you see, it looks very like the Athenian university, and it's even the first drafts were made by Schinkel, the Prussian architect, that you had also his hand here in Athens. So it's a sort of German-Prussian classicism that you meet in Athens, that you meet in Norway. So when this university was established, it was for the aim was to study Norwegian nature, Norwegian history, to create a Norwegian elite or a Norwegian functionaries. But the architecture was borrowed from Antiquity or from Prussian, the Prussian version of Antiquity. And then the question came up, and that's what they are discussing. The question came up if this classical culture, this architecture, these connections to Homer, to the literature, to everything, should that be for the already established elite, or should it be a popular common heritage that should be implanted into the nation? And those are questions that you will see will come up in the case I'm going to present. But first, this picture that I love. It's from Gerhard Munthe. He was one of the illustrators of the Heimskringla, the Norwegian sagas. So he was a quite national-oriented painter. And this is the draft for decorating the stock change in Oslo. And this is the Greek gods bringing modernity into Norway. So, and you see, for us it's not very modern, but it's even a little fine. And this is an important point, because when we talk about the search for identity, the translation of the classics, we think that it's a sort of nostalgic movement, that you are going back to antiquity to create something, to go back in some way. But all this movement, this classicizing movement, the aim is to create something new. So you go back to antiquity to create something new, even in Norway. So you don't have your own antiquity, but you need the Greek gods to come here and to make, and you will see if you see near on it, factories and things going on there. And so it's a sort of combination of modern and not so modern things, because you have this picture with a letter in front. So just remember that the reason for having this picture is to show how progressive this movement, this classicizing movement was. It was really to create a new nation and then to go back to the Greeks, to go forward into modernity. And the central person and the central topic in this is Homer. And there we have a very famous Norwegian government with Einar Gerhardsen, the labor, I don't know for how many years. He was prime minister. But government in the 1960s. And what do we have behind? A tapestry made in the old Norwegian textile technique, but of the Trojan horse. It's a Homeric topic in this big tapestry by Hanna Ryggen, and it's made with with flowers from Norwegian nature, and even the blue. I think I have the colors. The blue color is made by urine from male members of her family. So this is really a very traditional tapestry, but with a classic topic. And the Norwegian poet Sigmund Skar, he said that the translation of the antique texts and the uses of the classic topics, the Greek topics, the Homeric topics, were midwives for the domestic. So the domestic needed a midwife to be born. And this midwife was this. It was the histories from Homer, it was the text, this was the classical culture. So it wasn't, it was an interest in the classics itself, but it was to go further on and to show that you, for those they could show that we are not only a small gang in the far north, we are connected to the classical topic. I can send you the
It's very fun.
So then, men, it was only men, began to translate Homer. Not the all of it, but some songs. And as you asked for if it was Danish or the New Norwegian, it was nearly one of half and half. Some translated into the dialectical and some into the urban language. And the first of those, Fredrik Maltebugge, his translation was so hardly criticized that he died 6 months after the publication. So it's a very, I will stop off with it because that was really a debate over all the newspapers in Norway. It was a debate about much more than Homer, but Homer was like the starting point of all of it. So this is Fredrik Maltebugge. He was a teacher of Latin and Greek, and he sat down and he translated the first 3 songs of the Iliad. And he wrote an impressive introduction to this translation. And in fact, I think the debate that followed the debates, or several, were more about the introduction than about the translation itself. Because the translation is nearly Danish, it's really not very shocking in his uses of words. But he had a political agenda, and that was to use the Norwegian, to use Homer to revitalize the Norwegian language. He uses like all men in the 19th century, a very flowing language. So he said, I made this translation because in Norway we still have a language that is nearly hidden, that is dying, but we can take it up from the abundant deposits, like the digging up that the country hides in her land. Som gjemmer i sitt skjønn, og som Ivar Aasen nu har brakt for dagen. So that's the gathering dialects in Norway. But he wants to use Homer to revitalize the language. And he says that the antique color, the esprit, the essence of Homer can only be transposed by using a similar color in the national stamp. So he uses Homer to create a new Norwegian language, or in fact he doesn't, but he says that he wants to do it. And he has, I think, yes. He does this. He translates Homer because he says it is to save what is still to be saved of the old Norse elements living in the Norwegian regional dialects. So he's using Homer. It's not a sort of educational project or something. It's just to how can we save the real archaic elements in Norwegian? We can save them by translating Homer. And that's why the Norwegian have to strike when the iron is hot, not to wait any longer. And this translation has a triple agenda, in fact. He wants it to be cheap, so he translates only 3 songs, and it's a very sort of primitive publication, so it can be sold by booklets. It's not like the sagas, or not like the Bible or something. It should be for everyone. It's a democratic agenda. And he wants to recreate Homer's world and his poetic manners that belong to, and that's the point here, humanity's childhood. So he wants to go back to really the origins of humanity. And he wants to purify the Norwegian language, bringing it back to the Old Norse. So it's a win-win-win situation, and he makes all this. And for maybe some of you will go home and try to find the translation, and you will be very disappointed because he's using very few Norwegian words, just some small signs of Norwegian. He's saying gutt instead of dreng, and værfar instead of svoger, such small, svigerfar, just some small linguistic elements. But his agenda is quite radical. So it's the agenda that makes the scandal, because it becomes a scandal. Much text on this one. And that's what is called, or what I call, the Homer controversy because after this publication of the 3 songs and the introduction by Julia, Fredrik Ludvig Vida, that's a very diplomatic name still in Norway. He worked at the Cathedral School in Oslo and was a well-known Latinist. And he started his attack of Bugge's translation. And he was also the editor of a journal called Christiania Postscript, so big like journals at that time. And 3 days or 3 weeks, or I don't know how often it was published, but he covered all the front page, double front page, 3 editions following each other with critics of Bugge. So it was really like this 3 times. Criticizing Bugge and his agenda. Not the text itself, just the idea of transposing Homer into Norwegian. So his target is his main point. Yes. His main point is this. The Greek gods don't find their Olympus at the rock summits of Dovre. And Dovre, that's the national mountain, it's around which the constitution is made in some way. So Vibe's point is that you can't transpose the Greek poetry, you can't transpose gods and Homer into this nature. It's ontology. Yes, I'll go back to this one because Vibe's political agenda is evident in his short comments that are really not that short. He gives a sort of cultural analysis. He argues that literary culture has evolved through the centuries, but since something has happened, and that it would be devastating to try to lead it back to a lost stage. This would be in the vein of Rousseau, he says. So he don't want to go back to nature. He says, well, we have culture in Norway, and the Norwegian language cannot support Homer. We want a language and translations for an elite, Danish-speaking elite. And then, at the same time, Bugge, the translator, he was fired from his work at Trondheim, and he had a notorious alcoholic problem. So everybody knew he was drinking. So then Vibe's brother, Andreas, he he made a parodic translation of Homer, of the just 40 lines, I think, of the Iliad, the third song, and he made a parody into what he called Kipperviksk, and that's a parody of the dialectical Norwegian, because he's translating into a sort of drunkard, poor city language. So that's just to kill this poor Bugge, and he managed to do it. So he said, translating into Norwegian, it's like translating into an urban, lumpen proletarian language. And this parody, that should be an argument against the possibility of translating Homer, became very popular in the elite milieu that knew Danish and Latin and Greek and everything. And then after this parodic translation, this is quite funny for Norwegians, the debate went on with a dialectical version to protest against this one, and then some more satirical publications, and then large articles against, pro and against Vibe, and pro and against the possibility of translating Homer into Norwegian. And then we see the antagonists that were those elitists that didn't want the classical culture to be distributed all over the country. And then you had, like Bugge, a wide range of fighters for a new liberated Norwegian language, and that wanted to show that this language could really be used for everything, also for the most important of all things, that means Homer. And what's under all this is the fear of a vulgarization of the Greek heritage. That's Vibe's fear. That's his fear of those Olympian gods coming to Dovre. And we have this illustrated by a restaurant in Oslo that, and I think that when it was created it was quite chic, but then it became more and more dirty and dubious, and that's the the Olympic presence in Oslo.
Sorry.
I'll try to. So, those discussions about Homer in Norwegian are interesting for Norwegians. I think they are interesting for all people working with classical reception, because parts of the discussions are similar to what's going on in other countries, and parts of the discussion is very peculiar for the Norwegian case. I think the most historical clearest parallel to this discussion is about the translation of Homer by Madame Dacier in France, and the counter-translation by de la Motte, who was making a counter-translation. Because Anne Dacier, and I would have liked to prefer her, because she's one of the rare women translating Homer, but she represents in some way Wibe, the conservative translation of Homer. She does it so very exactly, and it proper French, and into prose, it's not a metrical translation. So it's a translation, traduction savant from her. And then de la Motte, he didn't know Greek, he just relied on other translations, and he made a popular metric translation like Bugge knew Greek. But de la Motte, he did this just to reach people, to make it accessible, and to get the hexametric style, to make it alive in French. So this French example, much earlier than Bugge and Wibe, shows it's a parallel, but it also it's presenting the same questions that the Norwegian case, and that's why was it so important to translate Homer, and why was it so why did people get so excited by Homeric translations? Why wasn't it just a paper among other, but why was Homer so important? And that the reason for that is defined in the Romantic movement. Because the translations of Homer should show the poetic power of the modern language, and should implant the common European heritage into the individual nation's ground. So Homer, that was the person and the text that should do all this. Plato, no. Virgilius, not just Homer. And why Homer? Because he was the first one. He was the eldest one. So the elderness of Homer, that was an argument in itself. He was the first, he was closest to the truth, he was the childhood of the European civilization, so he could do all this, the other poets not. So that was why it was so important to use him and to implant him in the individual national ground. And this is the Romantic heritage coming, like the architects, coming from, yes, we have Shelley, but we have the Germans. Yes, so here we have the Shelley citation, because the poems of Homer are the delight of infant Greece. So it's all the time, we want to go back to the childhood, to the very beginning, and then it has to be translated. And in the German version of this, they use Curtius, he says, die Griechen, but you could say Homer, durch die Griechen zu uns selbst zurück. So they used the Homer and the Greeks just to come back to themselves. So Homer it's not just a midwife, but it's a sort of savior. Because the universal, the global thoughts could only be expressed through the individual. That's the romantic vademecum. That we can't have such universal things, you have to go through the national, through the individual language. So, this was the reason, I think, for the position of Homer. Because he's the first one, he's the eldest one, and it's through him that everything should be proved in some way. The Norwegian translations of Homer went so quite in parallel with the translations of the Bible. So they had the Bible, Homer, and the Communist Manifesto. That was the third one that had to be translated into Nynorsk and Bokmål and retranslated every time. But it's quite a similar chronology. First partly translations into dialects, then more official translations. And in both cases, we have this linguistic domestication. That you want to borrow the text, the images, the metaphors, you want to borrow it into the national language. So both the Bible and the Bible translations were not paid by the church, but by the language movement. So it was part of the struggle for that Norwegian language, just like Homer. So both the Bible and the Homer translators, they aim at taking the text back to their true origins. So it's a sort of, those texts are very old, we have to get them back and to have them in the childish, pure version. And that can happen when doing it into a pure Norwegian language. But in Homer's case, we have one more element. And now I have some Norwegian citation that I can translate. Maybe some of you can help me, but I think I can read it in Norwegian and can translate. That's Åsmund Olavsson Vinje, so we are here in the middle of the 19th century. He has a poem called Back to Antiquity. And where he says, Venus skal være som fordom hun var, det kvende så fine, ikke med skingnom og sjal, og med slep eller stor krinoline. That means that Venus, the goddess, and the Greeks and the antiquity, because he wants to go back to antiquity, it should be liberated from the French and the European tradition, and it should be pure again. And the Norwegians could help to do this because they were themselves in this pure position. So not only Homer helped the Norwegians to find that identity, but Norwegians could even help Homer and the Greeks to be real, to liberate from this European chic style from the Renaissance and to modernity. So that's what happens with the classics with Homer, but not with the Bible. So this liberation from the French and from the corruption of the European tradition, this is peculiar for Homer and for Homer in Norwegian. So that's our contribution. So that's why I'm going back to Gerhard Munde and his illustrations, because new Greek gods coming to this modern Norway, and they come and they bring poetry and they bring fruits, exotic more or less fruits, and they do, and by doing this they give something to the Norwegians. They give the possibility to the Norwegians to create a modern state, but in tune with Åsmund Olavsson Vinje and this critic of the corruption of the classical tradition. The Norwegians can also help those strange goddesses and gods to be themselves again. So, through the Greeks and back to ourselves, but also through ourselves and giving something back to the Greeks. So that was a little presentation of Homer in Norwegian. So feel free to ask questions in that.
Questions, comments?
I like these pictures because, and the previous mural that you showed us at the beginning, it made me think of the saying, beware of Greeks bearing gifts, expressing an ambivalence towards modernity. Modernity represented with the telephone, but at the same time this criticism that modernity brings along with it a whole new set of problems in the 19th century and early 20th.
Yes, because I think on this one we don't have those signs of modernity, so that's the other one. But I think the interesting thing is also that it was planned to be in the stock exchange, so really in the center for the commercial activities in Norway.
Is that also the setting, putting it in the stock exchange, is that also part of Norwegian bourgeois society trying to show itself as urbane and sophisticated?
Yes.
We're not just interested in making money, but
also, yes,
behind that money-making enterprise is this a foundation rooted in classical education.
Absolutely, and I don't have any photo of the stock exchange building, but it's like a Greek temple, or like a Shinkin building in Athens. It's exactly the same architectural style. So that's really, yes, a way of doing. Well, we are not just dirty salesmen. We have, but I must say I haven't been inside the stock exchange building, and when I read about those pictures, they are called drafts, but I don't know if you have some, if they are in some way or on the walls, or if it's stayed drafts.
Yeah, when you said that for Booge, am I pronouncing it right? I don't know. For Booge, the Norwegian person, translator. When you said he took an influence from the traditional, the dialects spoken in Norway, how much did those dialects itself, like, for example, you have different words for a thing. Let's say for grass, you'll have different words, for example, in different dialects, which is known to happen. How would those, like, in a more broader scale, affect his retelling of the Iliad or the Odyssey of Homer? Because if you want to make it accessible, you have to translate it to something which you understand. And you can't use sophisticated old Norse words to tell the same thing.
No, yes, and you're right, because Bugge, he discusses it in his introduction, and he says, I want only to use dialectical words with roots in Norse.
Yes.
So they have to be really old and to have Norse roots. And he says also that he doesn't want to use words that are used only in one dialect. It should be more broadly used to be understandable. And this is also, you asked for Norwegian, like Domesticating in Norway. It was a kunstsprache created by a man called Ivar Aasen, and who gathered a lot of dialects, and then he found a sort of middle way through them. So he created a new dialectical language that was not implanted in one dialect, but combined a lot of them. So, but that's a bit later that you have this standardized Norwegian. So Bugge is the first one trying to see, could we have Homer in Norwegian? Is it possible? And he argues better than he translates. That's evidence. Yes?
Just, well, I guess it's an obvious connection, but the language, the Greek, of course, of Homer himself is kind of a Kunstsprache that gathers elements from the ancient Greek dialects, various dialects.
Yeah.
And does him, Bugge, make that connection explicitly, or?
No, he doesn't. No. So he could have done, but he doesn't. And you even have, as you saw, you have a dialectical or New Norwegian translation of Homer by Amadou. But I think he's so eager to use the Norwegian that he can't really approach the dialectical richness of Homer himself. So you could have had a Norwegian translation really using different dialects for the different levels in Homer, but no, you don't have that.
The Greek language was taught in the high schools in Norway in the 19th century.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
It was first of all, it was Latin. That was for all the young students or the young boys. It was Latin, and they wrote in Latin at the university. It was official language was Latin, besides the Danish. But then, for the most clever or the most advanced students, they learned Greek as well.
Okay.
And also those of them, and that was not the most stupid, who went further to theological studies, they had to read the
Of course, yes.
Yeah. So that was also a sort of preparation for the theological studies.
Thank you.
But the Greek, that was, and all those small translations that I mentioned, many of them were for students just as a help. So you can read the Homer, because you have to in school, and then you have a Norwegian translation in prose or whatever, just to follow and to understand the text.
Thank you.
There's also a question from Norway, from Professor Jørund Økland.
Yeah.
Do you have the question?
We'll try to.
Yes, thank you very much to all of you, the Norwegian Institute, for organizing this, and to Christina for giving this great paper. I was very intrigued to hear about not just the Bible and Homer being translated at the same time, which is kind of logical because both of them require many of the same language skills, and all classical scholars had those language skills, so that's kind of obvious. But what you mentioned about the Communist Manifesto being translated at the same time.
Yeah. No, it's not at the same time. It's a bit later, but you have the same struggle between the two, between different linguistic ideologies in the translation. So it's a bit later.
It's something about, so I was thinking about this early translation in the 19th century as a question of language skills, but also from this information, it leads me also to think that it's maybe about what are the important books to have in Norwegian, and all of these three are somehow foundational texts.
Yes.
Also for Norwegian nation building.
Yes, it is. So that's what I want to put the Communist Manifesto into it, even if it's later translated, because it's so important for the labor movement and for the different wings of the labor movement. They all have their own translation of the text. Like for Homer, you had different versions for different linguistic ideologies.
I also have a comment and a question. Since you are exploring the Scandinavian context as well, other Scandinavian countries, have you seen any similarities, the use of Homer, for example, in other Scandinavian countries at the same time, or more or less the same time? Can you just...
No, I've been looking at it, but the Danes and the Swedes, they had a much earlier translation. So the big activities were in the late 18th century. And they didn't have this same national identitarian movement. So that's That's Norwegian.
That's very
Yes.
particular for Norway,
Yes, it
the
is.
use of Homer in
Yes,
the...
and the Bugge is criticizing, and he's not talking about the Swedish version, but he's criticizing the Danish and the German one. So that's the primary references, that's Danish and German, but they are earlier. So I think that's why it's interesting to look at this and to compare a little bit with Greece, because we have those strong national movements with strong linguistic struggles at about the same time.
So, am I right in understanding what you said, that Homer is an opportunity, translating Homer is an opportunity to construct Norwegian identity in the 19th century, but at the same time to participate in a common European heritage? So am I right in detecting that there's a struggle there, a tension between the national and the European sharing and trying to be included in the Western European family of art and culture and the revival?
Yes, and that's why those buildings have to look like buildings all over Europe. You have an idea how should a university, what should it look like? It should be like this classical building drawn by a Prussian architect. So it's a way of being part of a common European community, but it's also because of this strong linguistic element. It's like they want to say that we have a language that is strong enough to support the biggest poetry ever and the eldest and the best of everything. So we can use this language for making poetry of ourselves, but we can also use it to transpose to transpose Homer. But I think the interesting thing is though this idea that we can bring Homer back to himself in some way, because we have this pure language that is uncorrupted.
So just adding on, like, would the translations of Homer be used in like a political election kind of based context in Norway? Because when you have this text which is now pure from any Western European influences, it is now it is now a good starting point, like to influence the bourgeois, the rich, the rich, and you can say that just like Achilles in the Iliad, I am going to avenge the wrong, bring Norway back.
No, it's not. We have this tapestry of the Trojan horse, and that I really don't know what it's why it's this topic. I'm not sure what's inside the horse in Norway at that time, but yes, I'm not sure. But no, it wasn't used directly in a political way. But I think it's important to underline that Norwegian ideological struggles in the 19th century were much about language. Really, that was the field where strong oppositions were presented. That was in the discussions about what language should be the Norwegian one.
So this is the language being pure, being strong enough to support text. The epitome of European thought, the classic, the best European text.
Yeah, and those translations, they were like a trampoline for the discussions about identity, about tradition, about elitism, about democracy. And Bugge was accused of communism and of socialism, just because he translated Homer.
Just a curiosity, when Napoleon established the Kingdom of Italy in 1805, one of the first things that he did was to commission a translation of Homer to Italian.
Yeah,
in 1809, published in 1809 and translated by Vincenzo Monti, who, by the way, did not know very well Greek language and was helped by the Greek Mustoxidis. So, even in Italy, Homer was in a way considered synonymic of freedom and of independent state.
I didn't know, but that's a very, very good point to know that. Even in Italy, they needed to have this anchored in Homer.
So thank you very much all. We can continue the discussion with a glass of wine. Thank you, Christina.